Ladies and gentlemen, it causes me great pleasure to be able to welcome you here to St Paul's Cathedral this evening. My name is Paula Gooder. I'm Canon Chancellor and Director of Learning here at St Paul's. I'm a member of chapter of St Paul's Cathedral, so therefore lovely for me to be able to welcome you on behalf of the Dean and chapter. As many of you will know, what we are doing this evening is opening a space for a reflective conversation around a really important subject. And we hope that you will enjoy the space and the time and the expert panelists that we have gathered together to stimulate our thinking. We are hosting this at St Paul's Cathedral, but this is an event that is organised by Just Money, which is an education and campaigning organisation that aims to equip Christians and churches to connect faith with finance. This, as many of you will know, is Good Money Week. So therefore, it is a really good opportunity for us to have this reflective conversation around how money is used and what our vision for using money well might look like. And one of the really important things, of course, is the connections between money, race, and the environment, and actually how we engage with those three streams together. Our economic model has been described as inherently extractive and exploitative. And our four speakers today will explore this perspective and seek to articulate an alternative vision for the use of finance. So what I'm going to do is to introduce each one of our speakers in turn, and then they will speak for up to 10 minutes. And then once they have opened with their speeches, we'll then begin to have a much more wide-ranging conversation. So let me introduce you to our first speaker. The Reverend Dr. Peniel Rajkumar, theologian and director of mission for USPG. Peniel.
Thank you, Paula.
Do you feel free to stand or sit, whichever is best?
I will sit, if that is okay. In his poem entitled Saturday People, the Indian theologian Stanley J. Samartha reflects upon those he calls the Saturday people, squeezed between Good Friday and Easter, who inhabit that unbearable pause between death and life, to whom Easter never comes. And this is what he writes: to look at the promised land from afar and not to set foot on its soil, to dream of milk and honey and not to taste the mixture. There are many Saturday people to whom Easter does not come. There are no angels to roll the stones away. The prophets who lead the Saturday people die with them outside the promised land. And he ends his poem with the following words: there is a cross in every resurrection. Is there a resurrection in every cross? There is a cross in every resurrection. Is there a resurrection in every cross? This question becomes poignantly pertinent for us at a time when both the planet and its people face the genocidal onslaught of a death-dealing economy, which unleashes the statistical equivalent of a World War II against the poor every year. In such a context, how can the Christian tradition help us find the ethical resources that can reverse the current vicious cycle of death, in which God's creation continues to groan, to be enslaved, and wait for its liberation? In response to economic injustice, the Christian tradition roots and reroutes, and I use it in both senses of the word, R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-S, our faith imagination through the paths of justice, be it in the voice of prophets like Amos and Micah, or the vision of the early Christian communities or the teaching of the early medieval and modern church leaders. However, what holds these ethical impulses like a thread together, I think, is the idea of solidarity. God's justice in the Christian scriptures is always attentive to and shaped in solidarity with the cries of the sinned against. In the book of Genesis, God hears the cries not of Abel, but of his blood, the first sacrificial victim on the altar of human greed, and Hagar, a slave girl made refugee by competition. Similarly, in Exodus, the cries of the enslaved people in Egypt, the biblical archetype of the industrial society, ceaseless in its demand for slave labor, the cheapest fuel of the ancient industrial machines, reaches God. In the New Testament, God's politics of undoing the empire of his time, in solidarity with the sinned against, takes its ultimate form in the investment, the embodiment of Jesus Christ, the justice of God in human form. Not just any human form, but that of a slave and a dissident of the empire who is ultimately crucified outside the city gates. The ethical paradigm and prism of solidarity, therefore, is important for us in resisting the death blow of what we call the empire today. One of the important things that the prism of solidarity can do is sharpen justice in transformative ways in a context where human reason can be co-opted by greed. The Christian theologian, Jörg Rieger, makes a compelling case for understanding justice as solidarity. If transformation of the present order needs to become a reality. According to Rieger, the notion of justice understood as being in solidarity with those who experience injustice and taking the sides of those who have been marginalized and excluded from relationships is required to produce true opposition to the injustices of the status quo, reminding us that we will continue to support the empire by default unless we look for those particular and often repressed places where we encounter alternatives. Rieger says that this notion of justice, understood as solidarity, is more radical than mere rejection of the status quo's notions of justice as fairness, because it leads to unexpected reversals, implying not only attention to needs, but closer attention to those pressured by injustice, and reminds us of alternative sorts of agency and energy that are often underlooked. In a context where the bodies and voices of the victims of the genocide of poverty are overlooked as interlocutors of justice, the conception of solidarity helps us to be more attentive to the poor, not as objects of poverty, but as agents of God's justice. And therefore, in our contemporary context where reason is often captured by greed, the ethical paradigm of solidarity helps us to remember that no option for the poor is a genuine option for the poor unless it includes the epistemological privilege of the poor. The second thing that solidarity can do is to prevent us from fast-forwarding in our efforts to reverse the sins of poverty towards a cheap hope. Context of seemingly endless human and planetary suffering can often create a fatigue in imagination and tempt people to fast forward to hope. Such hope can be cheap. The Cuban theologian Miguel de la Torre recounts an incident when he took a group of predominantly white Christian students to the squatter villages on the borders of Mexico to learn from the poor. That evening, as they processed the day's activities, one of his white students stated that in spite of the miserable conditions she witnessed, she still saw hope in the eyes of the little girl. Hearing her excuse, Miguel writes, caused him to suffer an epistemological breakdown. And he goes on to say, the imposition of so-called first world hope upon bodies of color which will face a lifetime of oppression was a violent act which silenced their voices and made their bodies invisible. He writes, hope is a middle-class privilege which saves my white students from the inconvenience of having to deal with the consequences of their first world status and how it is maintained and sustained through the oppression of the world's poor, like these little girls. And he writes, as long as there is hope, my white students can wash their hands because God is good, and it is all going to work out in the end. Hope was not for these little girls. It was for my white students who prefer not to examine the responsibility in the crushing poverty they witnessed. A mental slate of hands which allows them to go on with their lives, singing hymns of praise to the Lord Almighty, who knows whenever a sparrow falls. Hope is central to the Christian ethical imagination. However, a cheap hope does not suffice. Solidarity for the poor can produce that costly hope that comes not from fast-forwarding from suffering to hope, but the deeper hope that comes from sitting with lament and grief of those struggling against injustice, what Cornel West calls hope on a tightrope that we practice in the midst of the muck. Christian imagination of hope in a violently extractive world order, which keeps no body counts, needs to be reshaped both by the cries of those chanting down the current world order, as well as the retroactive voices of those whose bodies have been burned and buried, and whose voices have been drowned in the cacophony of the powerful. Our hope needs to be reconstituted in conversation with the constellation of interruptive memories from the past, of the voiceless, the invisibilized, and the Abels of our time. And this means sitting with the sins of the past in repentance and repair as we envisage a future. To conclude, let me use the words of James Baldwin, who says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Now is the time for truth-telling. Through truth-telling, we can choose to be part of a different world. And for truth-telling to begin, we now have the opportunity to repent, to turn around and resolve, and head in the opposite direction. Now is a time when the writing on the wall is clear. The time to act is now. If not, the following words of warning from an ancient Chinese proverb might turn out to be poignantly true. And the words are this: if we do not change direction, we will end up where we are heading. Thank you.
Peniel, thank you so much. A rich start to our evening. I'm now going to hand over to Anupama Ranawana, who is a theologian and political economist at the Queen's Foundation and research advisor for Christian Aid.
Thank you so much, Paula. Before I start, I always need to have this caveat. I'm speaking without my Christian Aid hat on, so please don't email Patrick Watt after this. I'm going to sort of provide three little images. The first is, you can tell that Asians like poetry because I'm going to use a poem as well. The first is a poem written by Kurunji Nathan, who from an anthology called Voices of Asian Women, compiled by the World Council of Churches in the 1980s. And Kurunji Nathan was she worked on tea plantations in Sri Lanka, where I'm from. And the poem reads like this. It's called The New Woman. The hands which gently tend the leaves will now help to banish darkness. They'll work hard to put down evil and to raise up for all new life. The hands which gently tend the leaves will help nourish all that is good. They'll work hard to weed out poverty and bring in new culture, new art. The hands which gently tend the leaves will show new ways for humankind. They'll work hard to build those structures in which truth and right will be found. A second image comes from a piece of research I'm doing at the moment, where we are trying to understand how communities understand poverty and what they think poverty is. And I was really struck, so we're using a lot of creative methods and arts-based methods for this piece of work, and I was very struck by a gentleman who talked about the fact that he feels poor the further and further he gets away from his ancestral land, not just because of the physical distance, but he talked about the spiritual distance from his land and how that holds with him a sense of poverty, even if he has, some form, if he has an income or if he has a house. The fact that he is so distant from his ancestors and from his held spirituality, that for him was a deep sense of poverty that he could not get over. A final image comes from the Buddhist tradition, from the Therigatha. The Therigatha is the writings of the first Buddhist women, and they write about their experiences of conversion. They write of their experiences of taking on a new spirituality. And one of the nuns writes very beautifully. She documents a stage where she unbundles her hair and she cuts it. She takes off all of her jewelry. She takes off her clothing and puts on simple clothing. And continually she's speaking to her teacher to say, when am I free? When am I free? When am I free? And in the final moment, when she's physically taken everything off, she says, now I am free. And these are three things that I was thinking about when I looked at the questions that Sarah sent to us. And it helps me to think through and think with Asian feminist theology, which is where I sort of try to put my stake. If you look at the work of Asian feminist theology, there's a lot of, particularly Asian feminist liberation theology, there's a lot of consideration on what is poverty? How do we understand poverty? How do we really talk about poverty in a situation? And bear in mind, a lot of this, the corpus of this literature starts in the 1970s. How do we talk about poverty in a situation where our bodies, and they're talking about their bodies of color, their bodies that are gendered, are constantly traumatized and re-traumatized as they are sites of extraction? What is the word for thinking about poverty in this situation? And their first response is to say that we have to contend with the prevalence and the cruelty of mammon. And they name mammon very directly. I think we don't often say that nowadays. Mammon, who they name as the anti-god. And they almost sort of set mammon up as the enemy that they are fighting, as what is driving in their instances, for example, development and growth. And they talk about what development and growth has done to their societies. And when they come to define poverty, and I'll, for example, Marian Kotopo, the Indonesian theologian that I'm working with at the moment, she defines poverty in two ways. The first is poverty that is imposed upon us, right? That is structural. And that is the poverty we fight against. But she says there's another form of poverty which we need to take on. We need to take on, which she calls a kind of evangelical poverty. And that means a divestment for a need for growth, a divestment from this kind of unfettered development. So in that is that complex nature of how we can identify poverty as well, I think. And that's something to think through. But how do we get to there? How do we, how do we sort of work in the way that Peniel's talked so beautifully about the vision that we need to realize and the sort of the resistance that we need to put together. And here we sit in this time of, we sit in a time of genocide. I think we need to name that word. We sit in a time where rampant militarization has, I think, become a moral good. So how do we respond to that? And I think one way we must respond is to center emotion as a site of knowledge, as a site of knowing. So how do we rage? How do we weep? How do we grieve? When we go through those, when we center our emotions, how does an emotion help us to rethink a problem, right? That sounds a bit woolly, but I'll try to make it more realistic. And I think within that, something that we might want to think about, and this comes from our indigenous, from indigenous scholars and thinkers, indigenous theologians in particular. They talk to us about the concept of refusal. And refusal in this setting is not something that's destructive or a simple saying no. It's saying, what in this situation do I need to, as the Buddhist nun did, divest myself of from? What do I need to refuse that is told to me as a moral good? What do I need to refuse as a site of knowledge? And then what do I need to embrace after that refusal? So we might embrace the emotion as a site of knowledge. And when I was talking about this recently, someone said to me, well, where in scripture is refusal? Which is a very good question. That's the thing about, you talk about abstract concepts when someone gives you a hard question, so you have to. And to me, I think we have this manifesto in the Magnificat. The Magnificat, I would argue, is a beautiful theological evocation of refusal. There we have a Palestinian Jewish woman living in the time of empire who stands and says, he has scattered the mighty. He will do this. I refuse what I am living in now, and I know that something beautiful, generative, and a collective liberation is coming, right? And it's masterful and it's powerful. And it tells us that this is what we have to do to create something new. So I'm not going to talk for too long, but I urge you all to go back and read the Magnificat from this particular positioning and to think how it calls us to that kind of refusal. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. I shall be thinking about that a lot. Now, next I have Jeremy Williams, who is a climate action advisor for schools, among many other things, but we'll just stick with that for now.
Thank you. I was going to stand to speak, but I don't want to be the white guy with a clipboard pointing with my finger and embracing all the cliches. I wanted to start with some geography. So in the street behind us, coming off the square, is Paternoster Row, that way. And there was a man called Thomas Cordingley who lived there in the 1830s. He was an investor in the St. Catherine plantation in Jamaica, where 21 slaves laboured. Around the corner that way is Ave Maria Lane, where John McCrae lived. He owned a business that made snuff boxes, and he owned 8 slaves in Antigua. And across the street behind me, we could find the home of Charles William Hick. He was a hatter with investments in the Westmoreland plantation in Jamaica, where 25 people were enslaved. We know about these specific people and their involvement in the slave trade because in 1837, they were all paid compensation for their slaves. And as you may know, when slavery was finally abolished, it was the slave owners that were compensated and not the slaves themselves. And in gathering the information for that compensation, the government took very meticulous records. Those became publicly available a few years ago, and you can browse them on the internet. Now, those are a handful of examples around this building, but I could give you another 50 examples within a 5-minute walk, because we are surrounded by the legacy of slavery and empire, and this very handsome city that we find ourselves in was built, at least in part, on the proceeds of slavery. And of course, it was rarely visible here in London, here at the heart of empire. The atrocities happened far away, and that was kind of the genius of the system, in part. You could extract value from enslaved workers, and you could hoover it all the way back to the capital, and your ordinary citizens didn't need to see it with their own eyes. There was something that was stolen by plantation culture, along with the unpaid work of stolen Africans as well, and that was the fertility of the soil. Tobacco plantations in particular were notorious for maximizing yields year after year until the soil was exhausted. And then the owners of the land moved on, or they moved back to Britain with their money, because they had no allegiance to the place. They had no ties to the land. They were just there to extract value. A farmer in this country at the time would have had a connection to their land. So there's a good chance that it would have been in the family for generations. They'd received it from their father, and they were going to pass it on to their children. And so there was that incentive to look after it. But none of that applies on a plantation. You cross the world, you take what you can, with no obligations to people or to place. Now, the slave trade in that particular form is history now, but the cheapest fuel, as Peniel called it, is hard to resist. And across the street this way, there's the One New Change shopping centre, and in there you'll find a branch of Zara, the fashion outlet. An investigation in 2020 found that some of their clothing lines were produced in China in re-education camps where Uyghur people were being held. Those were forced labor camps. Zara have also used suppliers in Brazil that have been charged with modern slavery, where Bolivian migrant workers were being exploited. Zara's business model relies on extracting the labor of others and bringing the proceeds back to the capital. As a fast fashion outlet, Zara relies on constant novelty. So there are new ranges every fortnight in their boutique over there. And with such high turnover, there is inevitably wasted stock. Clothing from Zara has been found in an enormous mountain of discarded clothing, which is in the Atacama Desert in Chile, where it's dumped or burned. Everything happens far away, and the customers browsing the new designs know nothing of this, for the most part. Nor the carbon emissions, nor the depleted aquifers, the polluted cotton fields, and the skin conditions of cotton pickers. We could tell a similar story about McDonald's, 100 yards that way. McDonald's slaughters millions of cattle every year to keep the burgers coming, and most of that is cheap feedlot beef from cows that have never seen a blade of grass. They're a resource for the machine. And neither does McDonald's take any responsibility for the methane emissions from that enormous herd, which is warming the planet. Now, I'm not looking to pick on Zara, really, or on McDonald's. I have nothing against them personally. They just happen to be local to where we are, and so they're good examples. I could choose plenty of other examples around the city. Places that are all about extracting value from faraway places and taking no responsibility for the consequences, either local or global. This is what we mean by extractivism when we talk about an extractive economy. And what's missing, and what I think leads us into these extractive practices, is the absence of relationships. We could sum that up in a single word. Extractive economies like plantation culture, colonialism, or modern consumerism deny any relationships with others and any relationship to the land or to its creatures. They're just here to take. And that attitude is rarely made explicit in economic theory. There was a noticeable exception when Donald Trump ran for president in 2016. This is a quote from him, from one of his rallies. "My whole life has been money. I was greedy. I want more money, more money. Now I'm going to be greedy for the United States. I'm going to take and take and take." Now, what's the alternative to taking? You could ask a 2-year-old. It's sharing. And sharing needs relationships. And there's a theme here that I think runs through history and it runs through Scripture as well. In the book of Genesis, we see Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and this is where they belong. It's a place they've been invited to nurture and care for. And then in the story of the fall, we see a break, we see a disconnection. The Lord God banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. We read, and he is in exile then. Adam and Eve are homeless, essentially, and they're kind of wandering. And that search for a homeland kind of defines the story of the Old Testament then. You have the nomadic Abraham, who's promised a land of his own and a place to settle. The people of Israel escape slavery and they travel to a land of their own, only to see themselves in exile again. And then Jesus picks up this theme too in his teaching, and he talks about the kingdom of God and about preparing a place for his followers. And then in Revelation, we see a fulfillment of that longing. The takers and the enslavers are banished, and relationships are made whole again with God and with the land and with each other. And where does this happen? It's not in an otherworldly heaven that we're whisked away to, but on earth as the heavenly city comes down. So this is an earthbound vision of heaven, a story of coming home to ourselves. That's all rather kind of abstract and poetic, but what does it look like in the real world? To move beyond that disconnected extractivism towards something more embedded, towards more relational living. How do we turn those spiritual ideas into something that's practical politically and economically? Well, I'll give you some examples. I see it in renewable energy, for example. Fossil fuels are all about extraction. We take and we burn. And renewable energy technologies are almost the opposite of that. They don't take, they receive. They receive the wind and the sun, and they turn it into the energy that we need. They still need the minerals and metals, of course, to make them, which is why we need a circular economy, one that stewards resources for the long term instead of consuming them and using them up. And none of that means much if people are still being exploited, which is why we need business models based on sharing rather than on taking. So things like employee ownership, community energy, cooperatives and mutuals. And we'll need regenerative agriculture and a huge restoration effort to restore what has already been lost. I see this too in public services, which we easily take for granted in a country that has them. The whole idea of public services, like the NHS, is based in sharing and seeking our collective flourishing, which doesn't have to mean big government for anyone that's worried about such things. There's plenty of countries offering a very broad range of shared services without Soviet-style control, from cheap public transport to free childcare to universal internet access to high-quality parks and libraries and public spaces. And to do any of that, we need a politics that recognizes flourishing lives as a central goal, rather than economic growth or a place in an international hierarchy, which is why I'm an advocate of well-being economics. These are the sorts of practical things that can move us from being takers to sharers, from plantations to gardens, and from exiled plunderers to fully human citizens of God's green earth.
Thank you, Jeremy. And finally, we move to Richard Reddy, who is Director of Justice and Inclusion at Churches Together in Britain and Ireland.
Thank you. I've got 10 minutes to speak, so I'm going to speak like a Pentecostal, but stick to Anglican time. So in just under 3 months' time, the August building over the road will mark the 60th anniversary of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's sermon at Evensong on the 6th of December 1964. And as you probably know, Dr. King stopped off in London to talk about racial justice and to preach. And he was on his way to Oslo to collect his Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I'm a bit of a Dr. King aficionado, and many of us know Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech. But I think in accordance with the conversation we're having today, I want to talk about the issues that King addressed later on in his life, namely the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism or war. And for Dr. King, there was a clear nexus or intersectionality between the three, and I believe it's a similar situation with regard to money, race, and climate. And I think it is apposite to actually use the term intersectionality, as in its truest sense, this term pertains to disadvantage. And what we see in this instance, when we focus on these particular issues, are a section of people, largely black and brown folks, many of whom live in the global south, but not necessarily, so who are at the sharp end of these matters. And in my current role at CTBI, I carry out work on reparations for historical transatlantic African chattel enslavement, and also the work the churches should do to mark the forthcoming bicentenary of the abolition of Caribbean slavery in 2034. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because Jeremy's addressed that issue already, although what I would say is that the origins of the extractive economy, I believe, can be traced back to this barbarous practice or enterprise, as some people would call it. So we're looking at money, race, and climate, and for many individuals at the moment, these are not theoretical, but they're daily realities, particularly for black and brown people in the global south, but also even in this country. And in terms of money, I would argue that black people have had a rather disquieting relationship to it, as pointed out in terms of transatlantic African chattel enslavement. A price was put on black bodies. And once you put a price on an item, among other things, you give it a value, and black lives were deemed to be dispensable. And one of the triple evils Dr. King mentioned was poverty, and an antonym of poverty is wealth. And when one considers wealth in a contemporary British context, evidence suggests that race, gender, and class inequalities are a reality. But we're focusing on race, and there's clear evidence of an ethnic pay gap, for instance, which sees black and brown people earning less than their white peers in similar roles, and equally when it comes to work in general, as we saw during the pandemic, black and brown people tend to carry out more of the frontline or front-facing roles, which tend to be low paid, and the conditions themselves are quite poor. And this situation left many of them vulnerable during the pandemic to actually contract the deadly virus. And discrimination in terms of the workplace often means that they tend to spend more time applying for roles, and they often face greater obstacles in gaining promotion or obtaining pay rises within the workplace. We also know that when it comes to accessing finance, financial institutions were historically reluctant to give black people in Britain loans, and as a result, they were forced to establish schemes such as a partner or the susu, where income was pooled so that people could put down payments on everything from cars to a deposit on property. And I speak as somebody whose mother actually ran a partner for 30 years, and every weekend some weird and wonderful people used to come to our house and give my mother some of their hard-earned income, which would be the equivalent of several £1,000s today. And my mother used to just take this money and she would put it in the back of her wardrobe and leave it there, and then give out the money to them on a Sunday evening. You wouldn't do that now, and I wouldn't recommend anyone do that now. But as we all know, the Bible has a lot to say about money, and don't have time to explore it here, but just to say, the Beatles once sang that money can't buy me love. But among other things, I think it can give you choices. And in Philippians 4 verse 12, St. Paul says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. So that's what St. Paul said. More prosaic individual, the legendary actor, Sir Michael Caine, and I'm not going to do the accent, he said, I know what it's like to have no money, and I know what it's like to have lots of money, and I know which I prefer. But what happens if, unlike Sir Michael Caine or St. Paul, all you know is poverty? Well, for one, you don't have a luxury of making or sharing the aforementioned comparisons. All you know is poverty. And, I always tire of wealthy individuals who, on returning from trips to the global south, declare that the people were poor but happy, and that they envied their simple lifestyle. And in truth, they didn't envy it enough to actually swap with them. And for me, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you, this means that we want to see a world in which our neighbor enjoys everything that we do, which includes money. And in terms of race, I think the far-right related riots this summer reveal that racism is still a reality in this country, despite what some would suggest. And again, I don't have time in which to go into the hostile environment, Brexit, the Windrush scandal, Grenfell, George Floyd, and the aforementioned pandemic, which all have race-related dimensions to them. Although what I would like to say is that next year marks the 30th anniversary of Racial Justice Sunday in this country. And I would like to point out the brave individuals, male and female, black, white, and Asians, who have fought the good fight and fought for racial justice. And from a church perspective, if I juxtapose the diversity in terms of racial justice with that on environmental issues, you see a massive difference, a massive disparity. You know, back in the day, environmental issues were described as green issues. But given all that we know about these particular issues and who they impact, it's clear that there is a black and brown dimension to the green issue. Yet when you look at the church and who's taking forward these conversations, it's usually white folks, and racial justice is clearly off the agenda. And I would argue that such an approach is quite clearly myopic, given the fact that so many black and brown Christians in this country are from backgrounds where people are actually directly impacted by the climate emergency. You know, in June of this year, Hurricane Beryl battered Jamaica. My dad lives in Jamaica. And, you know, what's interesting about the Caribbean per se is that while there still is a hurricane season, what you're seeing are more hurricanes, and the intensity of them is ramped up. And, you know, I couldn't speak to my dad for weeks, such was the intensity of Hurricane Beryl. But to sort of make connections between what happened in the past and what's currently taking place in the Caribbean is quite interesting in terms of, you look at a hurricane, and most hurricanes are actually formed in the Atlantic off the West African coast. And it's interesting that historically, the currents and the trade winds that forcibly brought Africans on slave ships from their continent to the Caribbean to be ruthlessly exploited for the benefit of Europe all those centuries ago have intensified due to climate change and are bringing chaos and misery to the descendants of enslaved Africans living in the Caribbean. So when it comes to me and my work, in terms of money, race, and the climate, you know, they are inextricably linked. And for me, they are justice issues. They are justice issues. I talk about money as clear as a justice issue, obviously racial justice and climate justice. And if Christians are called to be justice seekers, I think we must recognize the fact that there are inherent inequalities found within these phenomena, and that we need to work together to actually seek to transform them. And currently, from a church perspective, you'll find individuals like myself working on racial justice. You'll find others who are working on poverty and wealth inequality, and then others are focusing on the climate emergency. And we tend to be working in our silos, and clearly this isn't working. And I think one of the things that I would encourage would be people working together. That's why I think this gathering this evening is good, because you know, hopefully it could be the catalyst for greater work together. You know, I work for CGBI, and at CGBI we believe in Christian unity. We believe in standing together, and that by standing together we are stronger together, and that we have a better chance of being change makers. And I'm going to end by, let me just check the time. I think I'm doing okay. Being a good Anglican. I just want to end by quoting Martin Luther King. And King says this, he says, "Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right?" And there comes a time when we must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. What a feast. Absolutely fabulous series of reflections. I'm going to take Chair's privilege of asking the first question, which gives you the chance to be getting your questions ready. But I want to ask the same question of each one of you, because I think for one of the questions for me that kind of comes out of your absolutely fascinating talks is, if we want to take this really seriously in our churches, what ought we to be doing? What does it mean about how we actually live out as churches? And it feels like a really good place to begin. And I am going to be mean and start with you, Anu. I will just go down the table.
I was really hoping for a little time to think about that. That's all right. What should our churches be doing? This is a really good question. And on one level, I think it will be a question of denomination by denomination, looking at, for example, what do we have? I think a lot of us are doing this already. What is it within our thinking and our theologies that keep us wedded to an immoral economy? Right, so that's a process of reflection that needs to happen. It is happening, I think. It tends to happen, I think, perhaps at more higher level spaces, and so perhaps there's a need to be doing this more in a more rooted way at the sort of parish levels or the unit levels, based on how your denomination is organized. One of the things that I used to work for Caritas back in the day for my sins, and one of the things that we used to do with the Catholic Women's League, when we were thinking about responding to the ecological crisis, we did a series of workshops which had a menu of ideas, right? So we look at a particular theological assumption, if you will, and interrogate it, and then come out of that by thinking of what are local solutions that we can respond to, but then what are kind of, higher level solutions. And the higher level solutions tend to, I think, be responsive to how do we sort of, I'll use this word because I can't think of another one, how do we lobby our churches to also change their stance about something? And I don't think we should be uncomfortable with doing that. I have a tendency to follow my parish priest around and ask him questions, and he shudders when he sees me coming. But I think that's okay. And doing it collectively as a group was very helpful for these groups, because they were able to come together and think through these action points, and think about, approaching their local council or approaching levels of church. So there's that sort of very simple, practical thing that can be done. And these reflections, I think, should also allow that time for those emotions to take you over. I think you need to be... All of these conversations are so uncomfortable for so many people, but you have to allow for that discomfort and be okay with it. You have to allow for the emotions that will overwhelm you, but then come out onto the other side. There's so many different kinds of recognition we need to have. And, Richard, you were talking about the race riots. What we really saw on our screens were lynchings, attempted lynchings, weren't they? And then we had the Prime Minister come out and he talked about thugs and called everyone thugs. And there again, it was this sort of driving a stake between black and brown communities and the white working class, as if we're supposed to be enemies of each other when we should be working together. And I think that concept of solidarity is something that the churches can be speaking to and to be bringing people together. Our great friend Luke Lana in the parish of Luton is doing that brilliantly. So if you want a practical example, go to Luton, which I think is now the Holy Land. No, seriously, do go to Luton and see what Luke is doing there with his multicultural community. And I think within that, another thing is what is already within our traditions is the idea of mutual solidarity. And it builds a little bit on what you were saying, Jeremy. how do we find those models of mutual solidarity, and how do we build them up? And how do these lead us to a more moral economy, is what I would suggest. And I hope that's an okay answer, because I had 10 seconds to think about it.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I was going to say something quite similar in that I think the most important thing that churches can do is talk about things. And just to give a bit of an example, I'm part of a church in Luton, a Baptist church, and it's a very multicultural town. It's quite a multicultural church, and you had all these young people in particular who were in the youth group, very multicultural youth group, and then in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, some of the young people started to ask, well, hang on a second, here we all are being friends with each other, worshipping together, and we've never talked about race. It's just, it's as if it's not here, and yet we all know it's here. Why are we pretending that it's not here? And they went to the church and followed them around and asked them questions, basically, until the church went, actually, you know what, let's have a conversation about that. And we had a listening evening, which was very painful for a lot of people, in the leadership in particular, and for just ordinary white people who had been sitting in the pews alongside people of colour and had assumed that everything was fine. And then when people's stories start to come out and they begin to say things like, why do we have a person of colour preaching maybe once a year? Why is it always the white people at the front? What's the mix of the elders? Why do I never get invited to other people's houses? All sorts of things started just to be honestly raised because people had permission to talk. And it was a very humbling experience. And so this is the thing, is asking questions is really important, but inviting questions is perhaps even more important. And being willing to listen and being humble enough to take that on board. We could say exactly the same thing about climate. I grew up in a conservative tradition, never heard the church mention the environment or animal welfare or, you know, I mean, I expect half of them probably would have denied that there was any such thing as climate change, to be honest. It just wasn't on the radar at all, the sense that we had any responsibility to God's earth, despite it being literally the first thing that the Bible says, is to take care of the earth. So anyway, it's talk about it. And when you invite the questions and when you make space to have honest dialogue, all sorts of things can come out of that. And we have to listen without having an agenda. So how can we listen and then respond rather than saying, like, tell us what we need to do, you know, listen, reflect, and work it out together as communities.
I'm going to go Richard next, because he got to go last first.
Yeah, I sort of want to build on what has been said already. I suppose for me, I mentioned the fact that, you know, these are justice issues. And Kevin is somewhere at the back of the room, Kevin Snyman, and he heard me say this morning. But for me, justice is everyone's business. Everyone, Christian or not, should be interested in justice. But what tends to happen, I've seen, is that, you know, within a church, you will have a couple of people who are interested in racial justice. And in a church, you'll have a couple of people who are interested in issues around poverty and inequality, and also, when you know, interested in environmental issues. And people just say, oh, well, you know, so-and-so, you know what he's like, you know what she's like, they're interested in these things. But it's not embedded within the life of a church. It's not top down, it's not bottom up. If it's the vicar and the vicar leaves, he or she leaves, then that issue goes with them. Or, you know, it's not something that everyone buys into. And I think if you want to see change, then it's got to be something that people say, well, it's for everyone, it's everyone's business. And as I always say, it's unfinished business. So it's not something that you opt in and opt out of. You know, I always say when it comes to racial justice that if a churches took racial justice as seriously as they have to safeguarding, you know, you would see change. You know, I don't see anyone really saying I'm not interested in safeguarding. You know, from a church perspective, it's something that you have to do. And I think when it comes to racial justice, if we had a similar paradigm, I think we would see change and we would see it quickly. You know, I think we would have to wait 30 years like we do now for Racial Justice Sunday to try and think, you know, there is change. But it needs to, as I said, it needs to be something that is part and parcel of the life of a church, where, you know, it's literally a non-negotiable. You know, it's for everyone, and everyone sees themselves as being champions, as being agents for change.
Thank you. Alongside ecumenical and multicultural solidarity, I think we also need interreligious solidarity, because we may not share the same faith, but we share the same earth, a common home. And therefore, one of my friends from the Confucian, I used to do interreligious dialogue when I worked for the World Council of Churches. He always said that the original sin of an imperial Christianity is the sin of hostility, hostility, where we tend to play the host always and do not learn to be guests at the tables of others, especially when others are leading on issues of justice, racial and ecological. Christians often do not know how to become part of that. And therefore, cultivating that humility to be guests at others' tables is something that we can learn, because the earth that we share is our common home. And therefore, working hand in hand with people of other faiths is something that churches can probably encourage people within our own churches to do.
Thank you. Let me end by thanking our panellists so much, because it's been such a rich and thought-provoking evening, and I know I'll be taking lots and lots of things away to think about more. But Anu, Jeremy, Peniel and Richard, thank you so much. It's been great to have listened to you this evening.